Okay. That was my question.
Have you tried rebooting it?
You said you guys were getting it.
What?
Ah, we got it.
We're live.
Got something. Oh, we have Damon too. Well, we're good to go. Adrian, are we good? Give me a thumbs up.
No, wait.
Okay. I will drink some more beer.
Go ahead.
Good afternoon, Bsides.
Yo.
This is Cleveland Locksport. Are you in the right place? Yes. Okay. Good. So I'm here with my co-organizers of Cleveland Locksport, Damon Ramsey and Jeff Moss. My name is Doug Hiwiller.
I'm not that Jeff
We
Moss.
have a former organizer of Cleveland Locksport here, Matt Neely. I feel honored in your presence, sir. So we're going to go through these slides very quickly, and we're going to touch a little bit on what Locksport is, lock picking, the basics of lock security, that sort of thing. So we've only got a half hour, and these guys are going to chime in whenever necessary. So Locksport, what is it? It's more than just picking locks. We'd like to learn about physical security. We'd like to understand how locks work. We're hackers. We like to take things apart. But mostly we just pick locks. So who do we invite to our meetings? Locksmiths. Don't have to be a locksmith, but sometimes we do get locksmiths who show up, which is interesting to talk to. Criminals? Absolutely not. Criminals need not apply. We don't want you at our meetings. We don't condone using lockpicks to do anything illegal. Oh, no, you're good. You know, besides criminals, don't pick locks. There was a guy upstairs, formerly from the FBI, who said exactly the same thing. Criminals don't use lockpicks to get in. They use other means to get in. And if you've ever tried to pick a lock, you know how hard it can be. You're not going to stand there for 15 minutes trying to wiggle a stick in a hole, right? Whoa, did I just say that? Yeah. So the common criminal tools are things like screwdrivers, hammers, pry bars, a brick through the window, not lockpicks. So this is who we are. We're collectors, we're enthusiasts, we're hackers, and we're people who want to have a realistic view of security. So why would we want to do this? Well, I think it's fun. It's my version of knitting. When I'm sitting and watching TV and, you know, just want to relax, I pull out a lock and some picks and do that. It's exercise for your brain. It helps you to visualize. Once you understand how the lock works inside, the best way to pick that lock is to kind of visualize what you're doing with your hands and the tools inside the lock. People like to collect things. We're lock collectors. I have thousands of dollars of locks, which I continue to convince my wife are going to be worth something down the road. It's an investment. Yeah, it's an investment, right. And it might come in handy someday. I did have to help my mother-in-law get into her house when she locked herself out a couple weeks ago. So know the rules. Don't pick locks that you do not own unless you are given explicit permission, like the ones upstairs where we have given them to you to pick. Do not pick locks that you rely upon, because you can break your locks picking them, and it could cost you some money or, you know, cost you some security for a temporary time. Stay legal. You should understand that every state has different laws governing the possession of lockpicks. And here's the code, if you want to look it up, for Ohio. And we're going to talk about that for just a minute because it's been hotly debated in a lot of meetings. So here's the code written out. I'm not going to go through everything here. Section B is what we're going to focus on, because Section B says, each of the following circumstances listed below constitutes prima facie evidence of criminal purpose. And that's really the key, criminal purpose. So we're going to look at these a little bit more closely. Number 2 under Section B says possession or control of any substance, device, instrument, or article designed or specially adapted for criminal use. Lockpicks are not designed for nor specially adapted for criminal use. They're designed for professional use and hobbyist purposes. That's it. Item 3, possession or control of any substance, device, instrument, or article commonly used for criminal purposes under circumstances indicating the item is intended for criminal use. So 2 points here. Locks, picks are not commonly used for criminal purposes. We know that. And using them in a Locksport meeting or in your home should not justify or indicate that the item is intended for criminal use. And this is the jury instruction given to a jury hearing a case on possession of criminal tools. And you can see it says very clearly, the defendant with purpose to use it criminally. So that's what they're looking for. You know, if you get pulled over with your lockpicks, just be courteous to the law enforcement officers, you know. Lock security. So what's lock security about? It's about buying time. Locks are governed by various security standards. They're rated. What's that? Building Home Manufacturers Association, BHMA?
Building Hardware Manufacturers Association.
Yeah. So they're pretty well known for rating locks. When you buy your locks in the store, you can see those ratings on the locks. Take the brand-specific ratings with a grain of salt. You'll see different brands will list like 8 out of 10.
A master lock
10.
number level 9 is still a low security lock.
Right. And you should also probably take those association ratings with a grain of salt, because here's an example of a lock that was rated. It's a particular cylinder. I'm going to blow up one portion of this under safety and security. If you can read what that says. They're counted on to allow carefree operation of those who are authorized and ensure a degree of security from the outside. An array of strength test evaluates the cylinder's ability to withstand efforts at authorized entry. So I'll let that sink in for a second. They're trying to keep the authorized people from getting in with this lock. Probably not going to work very well. The principle of you get what you pay for generally applies to locks. There are some very expensive locks that are going to give you higher security. There are cheap locks that are going to give you not so much security, and then there's a mix in between. Here's an example of very, very fancy packaging with their own rating. It's a defense squared lock.
Is that big locks?
Yeah, we're not getting the video here, but so it's just a lesson in not paying attention to the packaging. I think this is playing, is it? Okay. So we just took these, I ordered these online, took them out of the package immediately.
How much was it? $7.99? Ultimate security.
Ultimate security. So we can use this on our, Department of Defense
DOD approved.
$10, that's not bad. Solid brass body. Pick resistant. The choice of self-storage professionals. So this should be pretty secure, right? The keys look pretty good. It feels pretty solid.
Got grommets.
And it's got grommets, Jeff said. That's always important for outdoor locks, right? Keep the water out.
Yes.
You own that lock, of course.
Yes, I own this lock. I purchased this lock from eBay.
He got permission to pick it. Don't
This
worry.
is not an advertisement for eBay. There are other places to buy locks. Okay, so that was a technique called raking. I was just raking with a regular hook pick. It wasn't really a rake designed for that. That opened in about, 15 seconds or so. So I decided to try a different technique called rocking. You use the back side of the pick, and you stick it in against the pins, and you just simply rock back and forth against your finger. And that took about a second
Take
and a
note,
half.
that was a pick-resistant lock, everybody. Pick-resistant.
So always consider defense in depth, the same as you would for logical security, for physical security as well. You don't want to buy a $500 deadbolt and put it on your front door with a plate glass window right next to it with a thumb turn on the inside, right? So there's defense in depth. Not really. It's just pretty silly. Weakest link principle applies to locks as well. Perfect example. You probably don't want to use, what do they call those, eyelet screws or whatever, as a makeshift hasp. Okay, pin tumbler locks is what we're going to talk about for the most part. That's what you see 90% of the time. Every lock you see on your doors, at home, they're going to be pin tumbler locks. Most office locks are pin tumbler locks. And how they work is, there's a great rendering here that's available online. So we've got, let me freeze it if I can. Oh. See if I can start that again. Apparently I can't freeze it. All right, so I'll just explain it very quickly. So you've got two sets of pins in a pin tumbler lock. You've got a plug in the middle. The pins, lower pins, we call the key pins, rest against the cuts in the key. They're different lengths based on the cuts in the key. The top pins we call driver pins, and they're the ones that have the springs above them to give spring tension. And when you insert the right key with the right cuts to match the lengths of the lower pins, creates a shear line between the two sets of pins. Play it again. And when the shear line is created, that inner plug can turn freely. That's how a lock works. So why are they pickable? Well, under the ideal manufacturing conditions, if everything were perfect, the lock would be manufactured with those cylinders according to the lower image there. It would be perfectly in line, the cylinders would be of a perfect circumference and diameter, and there would be no variation. In reality, what we see is more like the top. Now that's exaggerated, but we're talking micrometers of difference here. But there is a difference. You're going to find variation based on the quality of the lock, as well as where the lock comes from, the manufacturer, and also the wear of the lock. If it's been used a lot, you're going to see wear because they're usually made of brass. So you're going to have variations in the alignment of those pins. So the way we pick the lock is that we use two tools. We use a pick and a tension tool. We call it a tension wrench typically. And here's an example of some standard picks. We've got a hook pick and a half diamond pick, and that's a tension wrench. It's just simply a bent piece of metal that you use in the keyway to provide a torque or a rotating tension to the plug of the lock to try to turn it. So determine how many pins are in the lock. You can use the back of your pick, or you could use the back of the tension wrench or the side of the tension wrench. You stick it in the back and you pull it out and listen for the clicks. Or feel it. You apply a light torque, not too strong because you're going to bind everything up and nothing will move. So a light tension with the tension tool. You find the binding pin with your pick. So remember that diagram where we had the zigzag pattern? When you apply that rotational force, what happens is one of those cylinders is going to be a little bit off center to the direction that you're turning your torque wrench. So when you're applying that tension, that pin that is furthest off is going to bind against that shear line first. When you stick your pick in and you feel most of the pins are going to be springy still, but one pin is going to be binding. You lift that pin, and when you lift the bottom pin and the top pin clears that shear line, the whole thing will shift. Maybe a micrometer, but it'll be detectable to your finger, maybe an audible click as well. And then the next one that's over on that zigzag pattern will then be the binding pin as you're holding your tension. You don't release the tension. So you just continually do that and click, 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 click as you find the pins that are binding and clear them. That's, in essence, how we pick. When you do padlocks, this is normally how I like to do it. I hold the pick kind of like a pen. I hold the tension tool with the tip of my finger over the lock. You can see it's in the bottom of the keyway. When we say bottom and top in the United States, bottom is away from the pins. The pins are going to be up here. The bottom of the keyway is typically down here. So if you were to insert the key, the jagged portion of the key would be this top of the keyway. In Europe, they like to say the top of the keyway is the other way around because they install their locks the other way. So that just shows you how you would hold the pick against your finger, sort of fulcrum against the tip of your finger. And we set it. That means when you've cleared that bottom pin and you hear that click or feel that click, you've set that pin. And you repeat the process. For those of you who read Python, here's some pseudocode for picking. So here's an illustration, thanks to Tool, for this, of a side view of the plug and the front view of the same plug being picked. So you can see here's the binding pin. It's stuck, they're lifting, and it clears, and the whole plug rotates.
Create a little shelf right there that's holding that up. That shelf right there.
So if some of the folks were upstairs trying to pick locks, and I would hear a statement such as, hey, I think I've got these pins picked, but I can still see them hanging down. Well, you'll notice in this view, the pins have been picked, but the bottom pins still hang down because they're separate pins. And once you've picked them, they're sort of floating freely in there and they fall down loose. And that's why you can still see them. That also helps you know if a pin has been picked. If you feel it and there's no spring tension at all, but it's moving up and down, you probably have that pin set. So the top pin is already across that shelf. It's already moved. Okay, let's move on. Security pins. So what do we do? Manufacturers figured out a way to make it a little bit harder to pick by adding security pins to the top pins in the lock. So they're designed to resist picking and bumping techniques, primarily the top pins. Most are, the common ones are serrated pins and spool pins. And here's an example of them. And you can tell which ones are spools and which ones are serrated. Spools look like spools. There are other types of security pins you don't see as often. Those are some of the ones listed there. Jeff can tell you about some custom security pins.
Anything you can imagine with a Dremel and a file and enough time you can make them. And I've seen some things that you can't really describe, but they make the lock completely crazy. You could also countermill the lock, thread the chambers, vary the springs from chamber to chamber, tighter springs, looser springs.
All right, so just to comment on what Jeff was talking about, one of the fun things about being in a Locksport group is you'll have guys like Jeff who like to manipulate the lock to make it harder to pick for his fellow lock pickers. And so he'll bring in what we call challenge locks for those of us who don't know what he's stored inside for us to pick. And it makes it even more fun. A false set. So the way that we clear these, you can see this is what happens when a spool pin gets caught on the shelf. So you try to push it up and that lip gets caught. To clear it, remember I told you never to let go of the tension when you guys were doing it upstairs? You do have to let a little bit of tension off to actually clear that spool. You see that backward rotation. And as you're pushing up on that lower pin when the spool is caught, it'll actually try to force that to straighten out and you'll feel it push back against your finger. And you just allow it to push back slightly. So we're running a little bit short on time here. So we've talked about picks and tensioners. Types of picks here, not really that important. Here's an example of some of the picks. So some are purchased picks that you can buy online. Some are picks that I've made myself. On the right side, those are different type of picks. They're called dimple picks for a different type of pin tumbler lock. And then a myriad of tension tools at the top.
These are mainly your brakes right here.
And I believe there's a paper clip up top.
There's what?
I think there's a paper clip.
There's a paper clip, which you can use to create a very rudimentary pick as well as a tension tool. All right, that's top tensioning. It's a different way to tension. Instead of sticking the tension tool in the bottom of the keyway, you would use it at the top of the keyway. Sometimes it gives better feedback for various locks. It takes a specific type of tool that fits very tightly in there. That's called a Peterson pry bar. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about higher security locks. We've been seeing basic pin tumbler locks. So higher security locks are where the manufacturer has added features to the lock or changed the physical design of the lock to make it a stronger lock. So here's some examples of physical or design modifications to a lock. They use stronger alloys in the material of the lock. The mass of the lock is greater. They use external protective mechanisms such as shrouding around the shackle of the padlock so that you can't get to it to cut it. Ball bearing locking mechanism. This is very important for anti-shimming. So one way that you've probably seen people get into locks is to use a thin piece of metal, especially those old master combination locks, and you can get down inside with a thin piece of metal, twist it around, and it pops the locking dog, and you can open the lock. Ball bearing mechanism prevents that. Ball bearings fit into a semicircular cut into the shackle, and it's forced out unless the lock is in the open position. That ball bearing is solidly in that shackle. You're never going to stick a shim through that ball bearing or around it. Paracentric keyway, it refers to a keyway that makes it very difficult to get a pick into. It's like usually zigzag. I think I have some pictures coming up here. Yeah, so here's an example of a paracentric keyway on the left. It makes it very difficult to get a tension tool in there, and B, to get your pick up to the pins without hitting some of that warding in the lock. If you saw the key that goes to that lock, you'll see obviously a bunch of different cuts that mirror that wording. On the right-hand side, we see the shackle that has the, what do they call that? The shields, the extra shields on the shackle. Functional modifications. So this is where the lock is designed slightly different. They add active pins, which means we have a second set of pins that unless the right key is inserted, the lock is not going to operate. You have secondary locking mechanisms. There are very well-known brands. The Schlage Primus and Schlage Everest Primus have a sidebar mechanism that has to be set with a second set of cuts on your key. These are very expensive locks. Medical locks, acid twin locks also have this sidebar mechanism. You can have multiple rows of pins. So you can have, instead of a 5-pin lock, you could have a 10-pin lock essentially, or even more. Multi-Lock is a brand that's known for its concentric telescoping pins, which is a really interesting design. So they're usually 5-pin locks, but they have a thick pin and then a thin pin down the middle, and the key is cut so that it'll have like little dimples in it, but it'll have little mountains inside the dimples for the interior pin. Rotating pins, very effective design that Medico and Emhart actually, I came up with the concept, but Medico sued them out of it. Right?
Something like that, yeah.
And then there are completely different locking mechanisms, which we won't go into, such as disc detainer locks. So here's a couple of illustrations of higher security locks. On the left is a blowout of the multi-lock design, and you can see the concentric pins. It's got the wide pins with the pins through the middle. On the right-hand side is a disc detainer lock, just a completely different design. Here's a Medico biaxial. This is a cutaway of a Medico with the rotating pins. And you'll be able to see when the key is inserted. So it looks like a typical key from the side. It's got the same cuts, and the pins have to be lifted to a shear line. But when you look at the key from the top, you will notice that the cuts are at various angles. And so those angles on the cuts interact with a chisel tip on the bottom of the pins, so that when you insert the key, it's not only lifting them to the various lengths of the cuts, it's also rotating them to expose a little slot. You can see a couple of the pins have a little slot on the side there. The bottom pins, the silver pins, have a slot in them. And when the key goes in, you'll see some of those start to turn. That slot allows a set of finger pins in the sidebar to fall into the side of the pins as it turns.
And just a side note, the machine to cut those keys costs about $10,000 from the factory.
For those of you aspiring locksmiths.
So as Doug was saying, the pin rotates and there's a slot that lines up with the sidebar. So when you have all three mechanisms, then the lock opens. So these are very difficult to pick because you basically would have to do three things at once.
Right, so we've got a shear line created and we've rotated all the pins so that that sidebar, that horizontal thing behind those vertical bars, goes in. Now you can see the slots in those pins. And those finger pins go into those slots.
And Medico also makes pins with false notches, false gates in the pin. So if you are picking and trying to grab the grooves, depending on the lock, there's different styles of pins.
All right, so we're going to move very quickly to the last one. You don't have to buy your own tools. You can actually make your own tools if you're handy, if you got a grinder, if you got some spare materials around. Windshield wiper blade inserts, that strip of metal, the stiffener strip of metal, is a great spring steel material for tension tools. You can actually make picks out of it as well. Pick making, I make my own picks. I use feeler gauge stock, and I usually buy it between 15 1/1000ths and 30 1/1000ths, which are your standard pick thicknesses. I don't know if we have time to do this one. So we can get started. It's 10 times speed. So we start just with basic material, some tin snips. I also put some handles on my picks, and I use shrink tube, heat shrink tube. It'll start going much faster here in a moment.
You're a pro at that.
I know, you see how fast I go there? So if you do decide to do this, I don't know if you see me do it in this video at all, but you have to quench your pick often, especially if you're using the thinner material, because you don't want it to lose its temper while you're grinding it down. You get it close, and then you finish it off with files for the final shape. So that's the roughed out piece. It still has a lot of burrs on it. You want to wear gloves, not when you're grinding, but you want to wear gloves when you're using the files. So you clean it up, you get the final shape.
Do you use sandpaper on those when you're done, or you polish them anyway?
Yep,
Or you
you'll see I use wet dry sandpaper to finish them off. And I apologize, I know we're going a couple minutes over, but we started a couple minutes
I will
late.
say Doug makes a fine pick.
So one of the things I like to do with my hooks is I put a little, what I call a feeler notch in them. I don't know if any of you other pickers have ever tried this, but I find it helps me get a good feel for being under that rounded bottom. So I'll take just a finishing file like that and try to score a notch right in the end of the file, or the end of the pick rather. So this is the heat shrink tube. And there's your finished pick. So, how do I get involved? You guys want to talk about how we get involved? No?
Sure.
Okay.
Third Saturday of every month, we normally meet at Launch House in Shaker Heights.
Shaker, yes.
All right. Launch House is a little incubator, startup, studio type thing. Where luckily they host us. So third Saturday of each month at noon, we usually run till 3 or 4 o'clock. Sometimes there are special events like Bsides, previously Nauticon, some other security conferences. Last year we did the Mini Maker Fair. That went over well. I think the youngest kid I taught was 7 years old with a pick. That beats the 9-year-old I taught how to solder with a blister, unfortunately. So next month we're going to have a special during the summer. It's going to be actually at my house in Geauga County in Chardon Township. So we'll have a little picnic with lock picks and things like that. So occasionally we do have special events, so it's not just the same old each and every week or each and every month. A lot of different people come. We have a core group, and it's really interesting. Last month we had Bob Dix.
And we had pretty much a world-renowned collector. He writes a lock collecting journal. It's the American Lock Collectors Association. We've had some locksmiths. We've had a lot of people from different backgrounds.
Some of the locks were considered art rather than
Yes, we've had trick locks and antique locks. We had YouTube forums. eBay is a great source to get locks. Some people have had luck going to locksmiths and telling them that they looking for old locks. Garage sales, houses that are being remodeled, Habitat Restore, things like that. But
That's where you can find us.
Anyone interested who's in the Cleveland area or otherwise, meetup.com/Cleveland Locksport.
Tool National. There's also Locksport International.
Tool, Locksport International. There's tremendous resources available for anybody who's interested.
Feel free to talk to us afterwards with any questions, concerns. Or
Yep. Yeah, we're going to wrap up because I know we got another presenter to come after us, so we're going to kill questions, but you can find us in the bar. Thanks.